The ocean is a big place. To call it vast undersells it dramatically. When a ship vanishes over the horizon, we can thankfully track them with modern technology. But back in the past centuries, when a ship vanished over that horizon, they might as well have been in limbo until they reappeared in port. Because in the days before communication, anything could happen while they were isolated out on the waves. And while many ships did return safely, there were many which simply vanished without a trace as well. Today, we are going to sail out into that blue void that is the ocean and dig up some of its mysteries from its murky depths. I will be telling you the stories of 4 ships which vanished at sea. Those ships are the SS Pacific, the Madagascar, the MS Muchen, and the SS Naronic. Board a lifeboat, watch for icebergs, and settle in for 4 unsolved ocean mysteries. We'll start with the SS Pacific. And if you enjoy this video, check out my other videos about ships which disappeared on the Great Lakes. Check out my video on the disappearance of the SS Waratah in 1909, my video about the ghost ship Orang Medan, and my video about a ghost ship that brought something to Norway which killed 1/3 of the country's population. Enjoy and like and subscribe if you like this video so that I know you want more of it. Starting off, we have probably the most famous of the missing ships that we'll be covering today, and my personal favorite of them. The Collins Line owned SS Pacific. First, let's talk quickly about the history of the ship and then about her mysterious fate. The SS Pacific was one of 4 sister ships, the others being the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Baltic. For their day, the mid-19th century, these 4 ships were the fastest, largest, and most well-appointed transatlantic steamers on the ocean. In fact, the SS Pacific held the Blue Ribband for 11 months from 1850 to 1851. These 4 liners excelled in luxury, and the Pacific could hold 200 first-class passengers within her accommodations. Passengers could enjoy steam heating in their berths, a barber shop, and meals made by a French chef. A liner at this time wouldn't have had electric lights. Rather, I imagine she was probably illuminated by oil lamps. Pacific also had high freeboard and straight stems which also contributed to passenger comfort by providing added protection from the ocean spray while out on deck. The Pacific was 281 feet long and her hull was built from yellow pine, white oak, and chestnut. The 4 sisters were designed by New York marine architect George Steers. The colors each ship was painted in were that of the Collins Line, a black hull with a dark red stripe running along the length of the ship. The 4 sisters existed at a time when ships were in a bit of a hybrid point, you could say, transitioning from sail power to steam power. Pacific had sails, but her primary means of motion were her side paddle wheels. As you can see in the painting, Pacific had masts for sails and a single smokestack. Pacific was launched in 1849, and her maiden voyage occurred a little under a year and a half later in May 1850. The ship's running gear was designed in such a way that if one engine failed, the remaining engine could continue to supply power to both paddle wheels. The steam which powered the paddle wheels were supplied by 4 vertical tubular boilers, with a double row of furnaces designed by the line's chief engineer, John Farran. The Pacific consumed as much as 85 short tons of coal per day to power herself across the high seas of the North Atlantic Ocean. The sails on her 3 fully rigged masts merely served as auxiliary power. Back then, engine failures were very common, a fact we touched on in the deep dive video about the disappearance of the SS Waratah. The reason these 4 ships were built in the first place is because in 1847, Congress granted a large subsidy to the New York and Liverpool United States Mail Steamship Company for the establishment of an American-based service to compete with the British Cunard Line in the transatlantic market. The Collins Line was the winner of these pitches, and the 4 sisters followed shortly afterwards. Pacific retained a New York to Liverpool route for her entire career. Now, on to her loss. On January 23, 1856, the Pacific departed Liverpool for New York. She was only carrying 45 passengers, typical for an off-season winter crossing. She was also carrying 141 crew. And that's it. She was never seen again, and she was one of many ships which vanished in the North Atlantic Ocean around that time of that year. Many others vanished that year due to icebergs being unusually bad. Pacific's commander on the last voyage was Captain A. Eldridge, a seasoned captain who was known for being daring but a very capable seaman. Eldridge had commanded 3 ships before taking on the Pacific, and he still holds the record for the highest transatlantic crossing by commercial sailing vessel to this day. After Pacific failed to reach her destination, other ships searched for her, but nothing was ever found, save for a possible small debris field, but this is dubious to, again, the amount of ships which disappeared around this time in the same general area on the same general route. The only real clue we've ever gotten came in the form of a small bottle which washed ashore on an isolated island on the west coast of Scotland in 1861, which read, "On board the Pacific from Liverpool to New York. Ship going down, confusion on board, icebergs around us on every side. I know I cannot escape. I write the cause of our loss that friends may not live in suspense. The finder will please get it published." It was signed by a W.M. Graham, and upon checking the passenger list, that name did appear on Pacific's last passenger manifest. A British captain who was traveling to New York to take command of his own ship. This note led to it being declared in 1861 that the Pacific was lost due to striking an iceberg. How could this happen, though? Well, the Collins Line ships had to not only keep their crossings at a consistent time frame due to a strict requirement as part of their deal with the earlier mentioned post service, but they were also advertised based on their speed. When a new Cunard Line ships were being built, which were advertised to be faster, it all likely combined to urge the crew of the Pacific to push her to the absolute limits, to stay not only on schedule, but also ahead, literally, of their following competition. It is likely, almost certain, in fact, that the Pacific was sailing at full speed and straight into waters filled heavily with icebergs. I imagine the Pacific steaming, full steam ahead, determined to beat the new Cunard Line ship, which was advertised to be faster than her. And in the dead of night, while deep in an iceberg field, she had a head-on crash or a sideswipe collision with an iceberg. You can imagine a scenario where the crew saw one ahead, swung the ship around the berg, and then crashed into one right behind it that they couldn't see. You can imagine all sorts of ways that the collision might have occurred. Pacific's sister ship, the Arctic, took 4 hours to sink, so perhaps the Pacific took a similar amount of time. There would have been time for the damage to be assessed, and for the passengers to realize something was wrong. If the note in the bottle is authentic, you can imagine how the events might have played out. Perhaps it is a bit of a romantic notion, but I imagine the writer of this note, who was a captain of a vessel himself, as I mentioned, again, he was traveling on Pacific so he could take command of his own ship, having realized that the ship was foundering, sitting alone at a bar within the vessel and writing this message for us as the water creeps higher and higher up the deck and as passengers rush for her stern or jump into the frigid sea, before placing his note into the bottle and throwing it off the side of the ship, before waiting for the end with everyone else. Who knows? This story does make your mind wander about the acts people partook in those final minutes. This story was long before wireless technology would appear on ships, so there would have been no way to call for help, and the passengers would have known it. Either way, the wreck has never been found. It probably won't be, as it has likely all but rotted away by now, and that single bottle was the only clue we have to this day. We don't know for sure if it was authentic, but most agree it likely is, since it was signed by a passenger of the ship. For a hoaxer to fake it, they would have really had to do their homework. Back then, fake messages in bottles were almost always signed by names which didn't appear on passenger lists, which is something we will see in the next story. Perhaps enough of the Pacific remains that one day, if she is found by chance, we can determine what sent her and her passengers to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. We'll never know the ultimate fate Pacific countered, or when and where, but somewhere on that fateful voyage, something caused her to slip beneath the waves of the Atlantic and vanish forever. Pacific's loss was nearly the final nail in the coffin for the struggling Collins Line, They continued on for a few more years, but ultimately they were bankrupted and their vessels, including two of Pacific's sister ships, were sold to other hands. Out of the four sisters, the SS Baltic was the most successful. While two of the four were lost to the sea, she outlasted her builder's company and remained in service until near the end of the 19th century, when she was eventually retired and scrapped. A true shame, as seeing one of these liners today would be truly incredible. While the RMS Titanic is most definitely White Star Line's most infamous of their many lost ships, this one is also a story worth talking about. Occurring just over 20 years before the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912, the SS Naronic was mysteriously lost in February 1893. Naronic was a cargo ship, specifically tasked with taking goods from Britain to America and then taking American cattle back on the return trip. The cattle had very comfortable accommodations to ensure that they survived the crossing in good health. And Naronic could also carry within her passengers as well, as she was equipped with cabins and accommodations for them. Like many other ships we've talked about, such as the SS Pacific and the SS Warta, SS Naronic had no wireless set to call for help with, which meant that, like those ships, whatever difficulty they encountered they had to face without help, as it was impossible to send out a distress call. Marconi Wireless, the company whose set Titanic would use to call for help with, would not open for 5 years yet as of the time that Naronic would disappear. At this time, the only way a ship could hope for help in a situation of distress was if another ship happened to pass by. With how big the ocean was, this would require a lot of luck, to put it lightly. So, after only a brief career, Naronic left Liverpool for New York on the 11th of February, 1893. She had 60 crew members on board, including several officers and mechanics. She also was carrying 14 passengers on this crossing. There were no cattle on this crossing. Remember, those would be loaded in America and then sent back to England on the return voyage. Though she did have a few horses on board, along with some cages of live pigeons and chickens. Naronic was also carrying enough coal for the round trip. After leaving Liverpool, Naronic made a brief stop in North Wales to put her harbor pilot ashore, and then she headed off into the Atlantic for her crossing, straight into rough seas from which she would never be seen again. So what happened? For the time, Naronic was a very modern ship. She even had watertight doors and compartments. Her crossing was expected to take 10 days, but when she didn't arrive, no one was worried. As I mentioned in the Warta video, at the time it was common for ships to be weeks overdue, so not arriving as scheduled was no cause for concern. Bad weather, such as strong winds, were slowing down several ships at the same time, so everyone assumed Naronic was in the same boat, no pun intended. After several weeks was when people began to grow concerned for Naronic's safety, and the safety of those on board her. White Star Line stood behind the quality of their ship and said the following, according to a journalist. They, White Star, think she's afloat and have every reason to hope she's safe. They stress that the ship is recent, built with watertight compartments, well equipped, handled and commanded by the best officers in the Atlantic. This attitude quickly changed, and on March 13, just over a month after Naronic left Liverpool, White Star Line said, "There is now great concern about the ship." After searches turned up nothing, White Star then said the following statement about the fate of Naronic. "We still hope that it can be safe, but it is unlikely that it will be found, because the Atlantic is crisscrossed by steamers and sailboats, and it would certainly have been spotted if it had still been afloat." To this day, SS Naronic has never been found, though the ocean did spit out some clues. On March 19th, it was reported that a British steamer had sighted two of Naronic's empty lifeboats, 500 miles east of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The first of the two boats were capsized, and the second was swamped. Like with the SS Pacific, a few bottled messages washed up on both sides of that little pond called the Atlantic. But unlike in the case of the Pacific, these are not believed to be authentic messages from the crew of the Naronic. One of these bottle messages said the following: 3:10 a.m., February 19, SS Naronic at sea. To who picks this up? Report when you find this to our agents, if not heard of before, that our ship is sinking fast beneath the waves. It's such a storm that we can never live in the small boats. One boat is already gone with our human cargo below. God let us all live through this. We were struck by an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm and floated 2 hours. Now it is 3:20 a.m. by my watch, and the great ship is dead level with the sea. Report to the agents at Broadway, New York. M. Kersey and Company. Goodbye, all. The message was signed by John Olson, cattleman, but there was no John Olson on the ship's manifest. The closest names on the manifest which matched were John O'Hara and John Watson. Some theories put forth to explain the disappearance of the Naronic include that she was capsized after being caught in a large wave in a storm. However, Naronic's earlier captain, who was rotated off-ship by the voyage she vanished on, said that the ship had never been unsteady. Some of the other messages and bottles which washed up indicated that the ship had struck an iceberg somewhere south of Newfoundland. However, this was disputed because Naronic's planned route took her 100 miles south of where ice had been seen. However, this was also disputed as well because other ships did report ice in that area. The same area Titanic sank in 19 years later. Ultimately, we'll likely never know the fate that befell Naronic unless her wreck is found, but since we have no idea where to look, the odds of finding her resting place are all but zero. What do you think happened to the Naronic? Let me know in a comment. Jumping back in time to 1837, let's cover one story that, while sensational at the time, has become rather obscure today. This story was one of the great maritime mysteries of the 19th century. It has probably been the subject of more speculation than any other 19th century ocean mystery. Second, of course, to the Mary Celeste, which is probably the most famous unsolved ocean mystery of all time. The Madagascar was built at the Blackwall Yard in London, a shipyard co-owned by the Wingram family. She was a Blackwall frigate, a name for a type of three-masted full-rigged ship built between the late 1830s and the 1870s. The first of these frigates were designed and built by Wingram and Green at the Blackwall Yard. So the Madagascar had a 16-year career, during which she was proudly helmed by her first master, William H. Walker, one of her co-owners. Under the command of Captain F. William Harris, the Madagascar left port at Plymouth on the 11th of March, 1853, and she reached her destination of Melbourne, Australia, after an uneventful 87-day voyage. 14 of her crew jumped ship at Melbourne, and 3 were hired on as replacements. After arriving at Melbourne, she was loaded up with a cargo consisting of wool, rice, and about 2 tons of gold valued at £240,000. Surprised no one has dedicated their lives trying to find her just for that. Those treasure hunters from Independence Day Resurgence probably would, to be honest with you, since they didn't let, an alien ship as big as the Earth itself scare them off. While at Melbourne, the Madagascar took on 110 passengers bound for London. Then, on Wednesday, August 11, 1853, the Madagascar was preparing to sail when police suddenly boarded her and arrested a bushranger named John Francis, who had robbed the Melbourne private escort between a goldfield and Keaton on July 20th. If only that was the most exciting thing for the passengers to tell their families in London about. Unfortunately, they wouldn't get the chance. The arrests delayed the Madagascar until August 12, 1853, when she was finally able to set off for port, heading back for London. The Madagascar was never seen again. We have no idea what happened to her, But some of the theories that went around after she never arrived included her striking an iceberg, her wool cargo spontaneously combusting, or her being seized by criminal elements among the passengers or crew and then scuttled, with the gold being stolen and the remaining passengers and crew murdered. Just like with the South American in my video about ships which vanished on the Great Lakes, somewhere on her voyage from Australia to London, the Madagascar was swallowed whole by the ocean and will likely never be found. If her wood hull is even still intact or recognizable, in all likelihood, all that remains on the ocean floor by now are some of the more durable artifacts, which wouldn't rot away on the bottom of the ocean, and of course her cargo of gold. Where these artifacts might be, though, is anyone's guess. You gotta wonder, if those arrests hadn't delayed her, would she have arrived at her destination safely? Who knows? We can only wonder. Let's conclude with a much more modern mystery, the disappearance of the MS Muchen. She was a German lash carrier that sank with all hands for unknown reasons in a North Atlantic storm in December 1978. However, experts agree that it is likely that the MS Muchen was likely struck by one or more rogue waves. But let's cover a little bit of history real quick before we cover her fate. A fate which is nightmarish, by the way. She was launched on May 12, 1972, and departed on her maiden voyage to the United States on October 19, 1972, having entered service on September 22nd of the same year when she was delivered. The cargo ship was designed to carry barges, or lighters, which in turn would carry other cargo aboard them. Lash, or lighter aboard ship systems, refer to the practice of loading barges on board bigger vessels for transport. These types of ships are known also as kangaroo ships. I didn't have a specific reason to include that. I just thought it was kind of funny. Muchen was designed to be very safe and able to brave the treacherous North Atlantic Ocean when it was at its worst, taking some of the lessons learned from centuries of lost ships that we've covered in this video to heart, and some thought that she was unsinkable. Man, once again, we've got to stop calling ships that. Back to Muchen's disappearance, the last time she departed port was on December 7, 1978, bound for Savannah, Georgia. It was her usual route, and the cargo she carried on this voyage consisted of steel products, which were stored in 83 lighters. These are a type of flat-bottomed barge used for transporting goods, and she had a crew of 28 on this ultimately final voyage. The voyage was going smoothly and as expected until December 11 and December 12th. Her radio operator was overheard at this time on a shortwave chat frequency that the ship was experiencing some bad weather. Muchen's last known position was reported by her radio operator as being 44 degrees north, 24 degrees west. 3 hours later, Muchen's operator began sending out SOSs, desperate pleas for help. The messages were transmitted in Morse code, and only parts of them were received, but one of those fragments paints a chilling picture. It said simply, 50 degrees. What does 50 degrees mean, you ask? Well, the most accepted theory is that the ship was rolled by one or more rogue waves and was damaged to the point that she was drifting with a 50-degree list onto her starboard side. Automatic emergency signals were also received by multiple radio stations starting at close to 5 a.m., but nothing further was heard or reported shortly after 7:30. Further, weak, fragmentary communications were heard from the vessel on December 13th. By this time, search efforts were underway. These final, desperate calls for help mentioned 28 people being on board the vessel sending them, which is what has led many to conclude that these were messages from the Muchen. Remember, her crew on this voyage was 28 people. A few lifeboats were recovered, along with a yellow barrel being sighted. When the weather finally cleared on December 14th, the search was intensified, with 17 ships assisting in the search for the Muchen. Muchen's emergency buoy was salvaged on December 17th at 1 p.m. 3 life vests were also sighted. Some of her barges were also found, and a week after it began, the international search operation officially ended in the evening on December 20th. And that's it. The last object discovered from Muchen was her damaged starboard side lifeboat. Today, our best guess is that she was struck by a massive rogue wave, or maybe several of them, and drifted for days, listing almost all the way onto her side, before ultimately sinking in an unknown location somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean. Quietly swallowed up by the waves before anyone could find her, as if she'd never even been there. She has never been found. She rests somewhere on the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean with so many other ships. The damage on the one recovered lifeboat is what leads experts today to believe that she was struck by rogue waves. Muchen's legacy is that final, eerie SOS call. 50 degrees. Because this ship has such a short story to go with it, I thought why not include it as a quick little bonus story at the end here. The FV Jutland. I wasn't originally going to include this story, but I just happened upon it and thought it was worth sharing. And it's on topic, and it's also so short. Seriously, the Wikipedia page is, I think, shorter than the one about the Door Point volcano from a few videos ago. So it just makes a good bonus story to end off with. So, the FV Jutland was a Canadian beam trawler. She was based out of Liverpool, Nova Scotia. Not the other one, mind you. And was built in 1918. She was owned by the Le Havre Fishing Company. We're already like halfway through all the information on Wikipedia about her, by the way. In March of 1920, the FV Jutland left for her fishing grounds off the western bank with her crew of 21. And that's it. Some pieces of her were found full of water later on by some other ships. The body of her mate, John R. Ellison, was discovered in one of these flooded debris, which were both dories, which are small, shallow draft boats up to 23 feet long. These 2 dories from the FV Jutland were found 86 nautical miles southeast of Halifax. No bodies from any other crew members were ever found, and we have no idea what happened to the FV Jutland. Theories range from a collision of some kind to even an explosion. To date, her status remains missing as of March 10, 1920. We'll probably never know her fate either. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed these mysterious stories from the seas. I had a lot of fun researching this video and reading these stories. Tell me, which of these stories was your favorite? Personally, I mentioned it back at the beginning, I love the story of the Pacific. She's not just a striking and beautiful old liner, I also just found her story captivating ever since I first heard about it. I think if I could choose to take a crossing on any of these ships, it would have been her. Just not on the voyage she disappeared on. I don't need to know what happened that badly. As I mentioned, these stories, like the Pacific, really just make your imagination wander. You can imagine so many scenarios and stories about what might have happened to these ships. You can tell any kind of story, and you'll know if you've been around my channel for a little bit that I'm working on books. And if I were to ever write some kind of historical fiction book or novella, it would probably be a story set on the Pacific during her final voyage. I've mentioned I'd like to do that in my video about ships disappearing on the Great Lakes. Ocean mysteries are just simply some of my favorites, and easily one of my favorite topics to cover in videos like this. If you agree and you want to see more, I'll mention them again now. Check out my deep dive into the disappearance of the SS Waratah, my video about the ghost ship Orang Medan, and my video about a ghost ship which ran aground in Norway during the 14th century, which brought something terrifying with it. So I'm going to wrap this video up. There's plenty more unsolved ocean mysteries, and maybe I'll talk about them someday. I think if I did a part 2, the stories I'd cover would be the SS El Faro, the SS City of Glasgow, the SS City of Boston, and the USS Cyclops. Maybe not all, but it'd be some of those at least. If you want to see those stories and more, like and subscribe so I know you want it, and in the meantime, check out my other documentaries. Aside from unsolved ocean mysteries, I've covered the full history of the Loch Ness Monster and multiple paleo and prehistory topics. So I cover a lot. Go listen to my readings for my upcoming original book, and until the next video, have a good one, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay safe out at sea. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed these mysterious stories from the seas. I had a lot of fun researching this video and reading these stories. Tell me, which of these stories was your favorite? Personally, I said it at the beginning, I love the story of the Pacific.